The topic today is fat shaming, something that we all have a lot of familiarity with. So, a couple of questions we might just kind of consider to set the stage for this is our own personal experience. So, sometimes food was very restricted, and sometimes it's for all of the children. Often it's for the child that's considered maybe overweight. So, what was your experience in your house? Was food restricted? Maybe that was also because a parent is on a diet. And in my family, I have a sister-in-law who had cake and candy and desserts available all the time and felt like that was the best way to go because people just kind of learned it wasn't scarce. And then another family member is like, well, we never had any desserts around because my mom was always on a diet. So we have experience with this. So just to touch in, what was it like for you around food restrictions? And was a parent ashamed of you because of your weight? So this is something that's pretty difficult for parents because there's a concern for health. And there's a lot more known about this now, about fat shaming and the effect that that has on children than there was 30, 20, 30, 50 years ago, for sure. Is that your sense that your parent was ashamed of you? And if that's the case, that can be really hard because it feels like they're turning against us. So we could be angry, we could be ashamed, there could be all kinds of different reactions that we have to that. Even as you're looking at these first questions that could be kind of innocuous, but could also be very triggering, notice your whole body right now. Notice your feet on the floor. You wanted to hold your own hands. You could look around the room, look for cues of safety. Just notice that right now, we're not in a situation where somebody is shaming us for our weight. We might have a lot of internal things about it, and that's what we're looking at today. But we're no longer a child who's being controlled by somebody, or we might have a parent still in our life who feels that way, but we're an adult now and we can work with this in a different way than we could before. Another thing that's come to light with a lot of this research now is having a parent expressing contempt for their own body, even if they're not expressing it for hours, can be triggering. So a mom who's always on a diet is kind of the stereotype, or someone who looks in the mirror and is like, oh, I look so fat, and who maybe won't wear a bathing suit because they're ashamed of their body. So if you have a parent expressing that kind of disgust or contempt for their own body, then it's very hard to believe that they're not feeling the same for you. There's a lot of sexism that comes into this. Boys tend to have a little bit of a different environment around fat shaming than girls do, although fat boys are still bullied as well. A lot of this is common with boys as well. But if you were labeled as fat as a child, were you shamed in public as well as at home? Lots of times, children will shame each other, call each other names. There's a cultural imperative and conditioning around girls need to look a certain way in order to get a boy. And that's not quite so strong with boys as it is with girls, but it's certainly a pressure there too. So let's just take a moment to put this in context. This is some of my history around my weight, food, eating. And right now in this moment, you could give yourself a hug. You could hold your hand. You could take some deep breaths. That was the past. We're looking at our history, some of which may still be present in this moment. But this is the past. So during these practices, really stop and keep aware of your body. Fat shaming is conditioned in our culture. It's very difficult, really. It's impossible for us to resist conditioning when we're a child. And even as an adult, we're saturated with images of thin people having fun and people drinking beer or in a party or in a crowd, they're having fun. We're really saturated with the conditioning that in order to have a full, happy life, we need to be a certain size, we need to look a certain way. And we also have a lot of images of fat people or people who are heavier weight not having fun, different conditioning and different ways that people make fun of that. So, a butterfly hug is one thing that I wanted to just kind of bring up. If you were to put your hands on each side of your chest and then link your thumbs together, then you can just kind of tap a little bit like a butterfly would, their wings would tap. And as we do that tapping from side to side, that's also regulating for our nervous system. So you could do that for a little bit. You could do some breathing. If you're holding your breath, then let your breath be more continuous. Box breathing, tapping. So let's keep that in mind as we're going through these. So, a little bit of the history of why our nervous system works this way. Human beings evolved to survive during famines. We never had a reliable source of food. So, we had times of feast and times of famine, and the people who survived were the ones that had the systems that helped them to do that. And fat and sugar were not available as everyday foods. So, if you look at, for instance, in India, they have these beautiful Indian sweets that were only ever used or only ever consumed during celebrations. And now they're consumed all the time, and diabetes has shot up. And that's an example in India. And of course, in North America and Western countries, it's the same. These kinds of things that we used to maybe have as a special treat on a holiday are now something we can have all the time. And so our systems are not set up for that. Our systems are set up for feast and famine. We also have the emotional and comfort eating that's in a response to the higher level of threat. And so anytime that our biology, our human body perceives a threat, then we're going to want to eat. We're going to want to do things that are going to help us survive, but also we're going to want to do things that comfort us. And we have these survival needs for sex and food that are manipulated by advertisers who make a lot of money off of us if we're always trying different products and different weight loss programs and all of that. That's a benefit for them if they can keep us engaged in it. And then the real truth is that diets fail for 95% of people. And that's because that's not how our human bodies are set up to work. The other component of that is that if we've been using food for comfort and emotional survival, we might have an insulin intolerance. We might have deep grooves in our body and in our brain that have turned into pretty intractable habits. And that's also contributing to our relationship with food in our bodies. So back to a deep breath. Being shamed and judged for our body and for our weight is not something that we can escape. And this is something, especially for girls and women, we're subjected to the male whistles of approval or hey baby or all of that, or just more kind of derogatory terms as well, being called out for being fat or looking disgusting, something like that. We get those comments all the time. And then we get the more common ones that are a little bit more subtle. They come from these stereotypes that are promoted of if you're a heavier weight, it must be because you've done something wrong, because you're lazy, you're a glutton, you don't have any willpower. And we internalize these ideas to the point where it affects teachers' perception of children in school. It affects our promotions at work. If you're heavier weight, you're just seen as somebody who's kind of a loser and who isn't a good leader and who isn't somebody who can be trusted. And so having these kinds of stereotypes at play is on the outside as well as what we might be internalizing them. And when Trump was president, I would see these cartoons of him as a fat person or a picture of him in his golf shirt with the fat hanging over his belt. I really strongly disagree with his principles, with him as a person and with his policies, but I always was uncomfortable seeing him being fat shamed like that. So there's a lot of that that's just part of the culture that we just see it all the time. And if we don't like somebody, it feels like it's a fair shot to take at them around being heavy. Having these high fat and high sugar foods, creating this dependency in our body, eating them stimulates dopamine, it creates temporary relief. And so when we feel like we can't resist them, part of what we're resisting is feeling better. And so most of us can't do that, especially when we're children. And if food is what we've kind of imprinted on as a way to feel better, a strategy to feel better and not so alone, then that has a lot of power, a lot of compulsion around that. And then setting up the good foods, bad foods really leads into, well, I'm good when I'm eating good foods and I'm bad when I'm eating bad foods. And it sets up this binge either or, well, I've already blown it. I might as well wait and I'll start on Monday. That kind of last supper thinking, which is really unhealthy for our bodies. And oftentimes we get into those habits of a kind of giving up and just kind of having a free for all and then getting back on the wagon. And that cyclical dieting is actually now they're finding is very, very detrimental to our physical health, that it's not good to do that. And so part of what we're looking at in our relationship with food is to come to some kind of sanity around food. And intuitive eating is a big movement that's been around for a while, of eating what our body wants and listening to our body. But all of this conditioning and the shame we feel makes it very hard to do that. Shaming people for their health is now absolutely been proven that leads to worse health outcomes. And we've seen all kinds of things in the last several years, children being getting letters home from school to the parents, shaming the parents and the child for being overweight. There's a lot of different things that have been tried, and they've all been proven that they don't help. So we're all kind of in this situation where we live in a culture that's very fat phobic and where we feel very shamed by our bodies, regardless of what size they are. It's worse if we have a heavier body, but oftentimes people with what we would call a normal weight body still feel really bad about their bodies. And certainly when I was a teenager, I was a normal weight into my 20s. And then I had some trauma and I started eating more and gained weight. Was really the first time. But the whole time I was a teenager, I thought I was really fat. When I look at pictures now, I realize that was wrong. I wasn't actually. So we have a lot of different ideas about this that aren't true. Let's come back to breathing and just kind of notice what of this last slide and what of what I've said so far. How is that landing for you? What's your experience? So one thing that's also true is that people assume that we can tell how healthy we are by looking at us. And what I've experienced and what I know is that a lot of people who eat compulsively are actually a normal weight, and you wouldn't know by looking at them. And sometimes people with heavier weights have healed their relationship with food and have a pretty good relationship now with food. And yet the weight is still there for lots of different reasons. So somebody might look at me, for instance, and go, wow, she eats a lot. And that's not actually true most of the time now. It's been a little bit more up for me since COVID and just the higher level of threat in the environment. But it's not true for the most part. I just eat kind of regularly now. I'm not as I don't binge eat the way I did when I was in my 20s and earlier in my life. So we can't really know by looking at somebody how healthy they are. And then of course someone with bulimia might be vomiting to keep their weight down, and we don't get that public fat shaming because their bodies are a normal weight, but they might be really shaming themselves inside. One thing about being heavier is that we have that vulnerability of being visible. So if when someone looks at me and goes, she's overweight, there must be something wrong with her, that's a judgment that isn't necessarily true, but it's a judgment that we just can't make about people. We don't know what's going on with somebody. And it's not just that we don't know if they have a thyroid condition. We just don't know by looking at somebody. But if somebody's an alcoholic or a gambler or a shopper or something like that, we wouldn't know at all by looking at them. And yet we can look at a person with more fat on their body and make assumptions about what they must be like or what their lives are like. So then we come to, somebody can be a healthy, fatter person and maybe getting lots of exercise, eating really good food, and somebody can be more slender and maybe be very sedentary or have other kinds of conditions. So again, there's a lot of conditions that lead to health and to illness. And I would never say that having a lot of fat on the body is healthy, because it's clearly not. It's just that there are other things. There's a lot of other factors that go into whether or not we're healthy. And shaming ourselves and being disconnected from ourselves has a lot of really strong negative health effects. And so when we take into account all of the conditioning that we've been talking about, the fact that diets don't work, our biology, the public shaming that we can experience, then we can really kind of sit back and go, maybe I need to rethink my relationship with my own eating and my own food, as well as how I think about this with other people. So I came across a woman, Svala Nolan, who writes about being heavy and being Black. And one of the things she said was, and we've talked about this so much before, I realized that protecting my mental emotional health is more important than being thin. And I've shamed myself for that. I've shamed myself for thinking, well, my body kind of takes a hit when I'm emotionally upset. I would have eaten. And really, what I should have done was something else. And so I just think that's probably a pretty prevalent attitude or idea that we have, is that we shouldn't. And in fact, if protecting our mental emotional health is more important than being thin, then that's what it is. And she talks about fat phobia. And what she knows is that her body is the size it is, which is true for all of us, and that our brains don't have the power to control our body size and shape. And in fact, our brains are working against us in some ways. They're working for us in terms of our emotional health, but they're also maybe not working in terms of getting us down to a thin body, because that's not actually what our survival system is looking for. Our survival system is looking for a body that can be healthy and have enough fat storage to make it through a famine. And so again, she talks about the culture. Our culture is inhospitable to people with larger bodies, that it teaches us to view them with disgust. And we internalize that. And we live with kind of in a war with our bodies. Very, very distressing to see how much we can turn against ourselves. So she has this book, Don't Let It Get to You, essays on race, gender, and the body. A couple of the essays in there are about this specifically, and about racism and different other approaches on just these topics on gender, race, and the body. So one of the things she talked about, which I thought was an interesting take, and maybe we're going to pause after this slide to have a look. We gain so much when we divest from diet culture, but we may lose the privileges of thinness. And what I would also say is that we lose the hope that we're going to have the body that we think we should have, or the body that's at the weight that we want to be at. So we can diet down to that weight often, and then 95% of people will come back to a heavier weight. So to give up on the diet culture has a lot of ramifications, and we're going to lose a lot of those privileges. So what do we gain? What are the gains? What do we get from giving up the war? The war on fat, and mostly the war against our body. So she names some of them, body acceptance, creativity, feeling sunshine on your skin, and I would add a whole bunch of other ones. So let's take a moment just to see what comes up for you when you think, if you were to actually give up wanting your body to be different. We're not giving up being healthy, but we might be giving up trying to control the amount of fat that's on our body. And just enjoying our body, accepting it. What would you gain? Notice your body, your breath. And anyone who's had a larger body can maybe relate to this. I know I can, of wearing clothes with longer sleeves so that my older fat arms aren't out there kind of for everybody to see. And covering up our bodies is something that's very common with people that are heavier. And what would it be like if we could just feel the sun on our skin? If we could go swimming instead of staying on shore? What would that be like? If we could feel comfortable in our body in a relationship, a sexual relationship, which isn't all about fat. And that's an issue for sure. What would that be like? And as you're thinking about that, see if you could bring it to mind using all of your senses. And there's probably some of these areas are probably places where you've already done some work and maybe you're not being tortured by them. And maybe others are. Or maybe you have a really healthy relationship already with your body and food. What if I'm always the weight that I am right now? Thoughts? What's coming up in your body? Is anything tightening up? Did your breath change? So, this is a question that might be quite intense, or it might be kind of just an interesting exploration. So, give yourself the time to stay regulated. Notice your body, notice your breath. And you can always take a step back, open your eyes, shift your attention to something else for a minute. So, how would you feel about that if my body was this size and I completely gave up trying to change the size? If it changes, okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to keep working at trying to change my body to something else. And we could do a reverse inquiry. So we state something and then see what the argument is. I'd be happy to have this size body for the rest of my life. I have no need to change it. And notice if there's any resistance to that. Notice your breath. What does your heart know about this? What are your emotions? Is there sadness? Is there a sense of loss? If I gave up all hope that my body is going to be the size I want it to be, what's your response to that? If you were to not have that urgency to fix yourself, if you were to have completely given that up, this is the size my body is right now, and I would be okay with that if this is the size I am for the rest of my life. Continue to notice. What are your thoughts? Work a little bit with the possibility of that. What would it be like if I had no compulsion in my mind, if I wasn't trying to change it? And then for the next couple of minutes, let's just do a little kind of a visualization practice. Imagine that you've come to complete acceptance about your body and you're comfortable in your clothes, you're comfortable moving around. When thoughts of shame come up, you notice them and you're able to let them go. And you might still have eating compulsions come up. You don't shame yourself for that. You're able to put your hand on your heart maybe and just be kind. Our conditioning around our bodies and food is deep. See if you could allow yourself to have the experience you do. So, if you were to completely give up hope for a different kind of a body, does that mean that you're giving up hope for happiness or for health? That you're giving up on yourself? Or are there other ways to kind of approach this as I'm not giving up on being kind and compassionate with myself? I could still really work with that. There's a lot of thoughts in the mind, a lot of what we know we should maybe be working with or trying to cultivate. And if we were completely healed, maybe we would feel that way, maybe not. Just to see if there's some room here to let this cook, let ourselves explore.